the Spirit. But the Bible talked about it in the book of Job. The oldest book of the Bible is the book of Job. And it talks about the sphere of the earth. And science has had to modify its views on many things that they believed were wrong in the Bible. As time moved along and they were able to research these things and discover that the Bible was true, is true, and that they were wrong in their assumptions. So we need to look at how we got the Bible, how God delivered it, and along with that, we need to look at the languages of the Bible. If we take the Bible literal, as I've said I do, and we leave that, of course, up to you. You have a right to be wrong if you want to be. But the idea of language is very important. And we're going to see that as we work with it. So I will make a lot of references to the Hebrew, to the Greek, even some Chaldean, because part of the Old Testament was written in Chaldean after the Babylonian captivity period. While they were there, Daniel wrote part of his in Chaldean, and very similar to Hebrew. But the New Testament then was written in Koine Greek. The word Koine is different than modern Greek. The Greek that is spoken today in Greece is a different Greek than they had at the time of Alexander the Great when he developed it. There were actually 5 different dialects and structures of Greek when Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world. He conquered all of the peninsula of Greece and discovered that he had a communication problem. Now, the last thing you want in the military is a communication problem, especially when he had determined he was going to conquer all the world and put them under his authority, which he did in a very short period of time. But when he started giving commands to his troops, they didn't understand what he was saying. They all spoke Greek, but some of them spoke Doric, some Attic, some Aeolic, and some Macedonian, and so he said, before we set out to conquer the world, we got to take some time and got to develop a new language. So he took the 5 Greek known languages of that day and sat down and formulated a new Greek language called Koine. The word Koine means common. Now it's anything but common. But he called it Common Greek because it became the common language of the world. Because wherever he conquered a people, he made them learn his language. Before they would sign a treaty with him, they had to learn his language. So that after a few years, the universal language around the world was Koine Greek. And even after the Romans overthrew the Greeks, they hung on to Koine Greek as the language of literature through the Roman Empire. So when the New Testament was written, while most of the writers of the New Testament were predominantly illiterate, most of them, some of them were not. Paul was highly educated, but many of the others were not. And the street language that was being spoken at that time was Aramaic. But the language of literature was Greek. So these Galileans that only spoke one language, and that a Oklahoma version of the Arabic language, they were given the ability by God to write in Koine Greek. And if you follow all the rules of Greek grammar, there can only be one meaning Now there are a lot of different applications that you can make of Scripture, but there's only one meaning of it. And I discovered when I was 13 that the Bible wasn't written in English originally, that it was written in Hebrew and Greek. And so I set out on a mission to learn Hebrew and Greek. And I was more occupied with Greek than I was Hebrew because of the New Testament and the doctrines and things of the church age. And so I begged and pled for help to learn Greek. And everybody I talked to said, "Oh, you don't want to do that. That's the hardest language in the world to learn." Well, I didn't give up, and one day our pastor had resigned the church and was moving to start a new work over in a different part of the state. And so I was appointed to help them pack and move, make the trip with them, and then ride the bus home, because his wife was going to have to drive one vehicle and he was going to have to drive the other, and they didn't want her riding by herself. So I was given the mission of making that trip. So we were packing up his library, and I had asked Brother Reeves 100 times to help me with the Greek, and his constant reply was, "You don't need it. You don't need it. You got the Bible in English, that's all you need." And that explained why he couldn't answer some of my questions. But I had asked him one time, why did Jesus ask Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Remember I said, and of course he remembered, when after the resurrection that Jesus was on the seashore, the disciples had fished all night and hadn't caught anything, and he appeared on the seashore, this after his resurrection, and he said, "Do you have any fish?" And they said, "No, we fished all night and hadn't caught any." And he said, "Well, cast your net on the other side, and you'll catch fish." Well, they'd been on both sides of the boat all night, but they did what he said, and they got a net full of 153 fish, large fish that they caught. But after they had eaten breakfast, Jesus had already started a fire and had some fish cooking on the grill, on the fire, and told them to bring some of what they had caught. And if you look at that in the text, there are 2 different kinds of fish. Jesus was cooking one kind of fish. He told them to bring another kind of fish, a completely different word for fish that's in the Greek text. He was cooking real small fish that were native to the Galilean, the Sea of Galilee, and they had a different type of fish, a large fish, and so he told them to bring some of what they had. And after they'd eaten breakfast, he said, "Peter, do you love me? You love me more than these things?" And Peter said, "Lord, you know all things. You know I love you." And he said, "Feed my sheep." He said, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter said, "Lord, you know all things. You know I love you." And he said, "Feed my lambs." He said, "Peter, do you love me?" And it grieved Peter, the scripture says, that he asked the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And he said, "Feed my sheep." I said to Brother Reeves, when I was 9 years old, why did Jesus ask Peter 3 times? And he said, well, he wanted him to really think about it. You know, if somebody asks you, "Do you love me?" Well, sure I love you, you know. He wanted him to really think about it. And the missionary that was there, that had encouraged us to read the Bible through while he was there for 2 weeks, said, "Well, Troy, you have to remember too that Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. So maybe that's why asking 3 times. The night of his arrest, 3 times Jesus denied even knowing him. So now after the resurrection, he's asking him, "Do you love me?" Well, when we were packing up Pastor Reeves's books, he said, "Here, you may want this." And he threw me a book. And it was titled, "The Golden Nuggets of the Greek New Testament." Now, it's interesting that I was 13, and that's been a year or 2. that I should remember the name of that book. That book changed the whole direction of my ministry, because it's Golden Nuggets of the Greek New Testament. It was written by Kenneth Weiss, who was the Greek professor at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And I opened the book up, and it said, love, love, love. John chapter 21, and Jesus' conversation with Peter. And Jesus said, Peter, do you agapao me? Agapao is from agape love. It's a self-sacrificial love that manifests itself in giving and continues to love regardless of the response. It's the word that's used more common than any other word in the New Testament, translated by our English word love. But not the only word. There are two other words that are translated love. In Greek, there are 4 Greek words for love, but eros is not used in Scripture. Peter said, Lord, you know all things. You know I phileo you. Now your English Bible says, you know I love you. No, he didn't use the word Jesus used. He used a different word, phileo, which is a love that's based and dependent upon response. I love you for the response that I get. Jesus said to him the second time, Peter, do you agapao me? Do you love me with a self-sacrificial love that manifests itself in giving and continues to love regardless of the response? And Peter said, Lord, you know all things. You know I phileo you. The third time, Jesus said, Peter, do you phileo me? He didn't use the word he had been using. He stepped down to Peter's word and questioned Peter's phileo love. That's why Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time, do you phileo me? Not that, do you agapao me? So those things come to light if we get into the original language. The English language has a great deal of difficulty in conveying that. See, you can say agape. That's one word. But if you say what that means in English, it means a self-sacrificial love that manifests itself in giving and keeps on loving regardless of response. What we really need is an expanded translation of the Greek text in English. And now I know people have been telling me through the years, then do it. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm working on it. I've got some of it done. It's time consuming. My grandson, who is youth minister over in Yakima, texted me last week and said, no, it's been about 2 weeks now. It was before we went over there, I believe. And he said, how long, Papa, how long would it take us to do an expanded translation of the New Testament? Us. So he wants to get in on the act. I can use the help. So I said, well, your dad asked me that question a number of years ago. He said, if I were to pay your salary so that you didn't have to work, do anything else but write, if I were to do that, how long would it take you to do an expanded translation of the New Testament? I said, well, if I worked at it 8 to 10 hours a day, I could probably do it in a year. And Todd texted me back and said, I figured it'd take us 3 years. And I said, well, I'm not sure. It depends on how much time we gave to it. And it would need to be thorough and consistent. But it would be several volumes, because it takes a paragraph to say what one word says in the Greek. So the best thing to do is everybody learn Koine Greek and think like a Greek, and then we wouldn't have to do that. That's not going to happen. So in the meantime, God has given us pastor teachers who have studied the language, who are able then to communicate that to us and to help us. So when we look at the Judaism and how we got the Bible, it's really important for us to explore that. There are some things that we have a great deal of difficulty explaining if we don't see what the text says. I mentioned